the second podcast that we've launched with myself, Dan Ryan, and Jordan Knight. The big news, obviously, in Australia is that Tucker Carlson is here on a tour sponsored by Clive Palmer. I saw him on Saturday here in Brisbane, and he had a very enthusiastic reception and has very interesting things to say, very NatCon-y type of things to say, actually. I'm actually interested, Jordan, when did you first, what do you think about Tucker Carlson generally, and when did he first come on your radar?
Yeah, I think he really sort of, like, I've known about him for a long time because he's been a big name in like Fox News and conservative circles for a long time. But he really sort of started to stand out to me when I first jumped on Twitter, which was a few years ago now, probably 2022 or thereabouts. And he was just this guy that, like, I would see all these, like, even sort of like dissident right, or there's more sort of fringe online right guys like across the world, sort of sharing his videos and talking about him and stuff like that. So he seemed like he was a really good sort of bridge between, what the normie the normal conservative sort of, worldview versus like this burgeoning new culture, this conservative sort of culture. And he seemed to sort of bridge the gap between those two. So yeah, he really stuck out to me then. I watched, a lot of his monologues were incredible stuff, and really sort of, I still do think he's like the most interesting political commentator in the world at the moment. He, more than anybody, sort of just has his finger on the pulse. But so did he discuss more sort of NatCon things and similar sort of style things to what he's been doing about?
Absolutely. And just to sort of double up on what you said, I mean, I knew about him, probably showing my age a little bit, when he had his bow tie on and was doing Crossfire on CNN and, talking about the Iraq War. But he wasn't really a cultural kind of phenomenon then. He was just another talking head, or at least that's how I kind of registered him. And then, he kind of got that gig at Fox a little bit out of the blue, right? I think it was Bill O'Reilly got sacked for some discretion. And then he sort of started to, I don't know, he definitely introduced new ideas. In fact, one of the things he said on the night, he's a journalist by trade. He's been doing it his whole life. He's also Californian. He grew up in California, so he has a sort of breezy, preppy style. But he's a journalist first and foremost. And the guy said there are very few journalists out there that actually listen to what their subject that they're interviewing is saying, and like genuinely trying to propose deeper, at least in corporate media. And he does have that knack. I mean, he's genuinely, some of it I think is a little bit, I can't help but think, given how professional and the success he's had, that it's learned a little bit. But that's whole playing dumb, tell me more type of thing. I mean, he knows a lot, he's read a lot, he's a very smart guy. He could probably, but he has the way of drawing out information from the people he's interviewing, and I think he's genuinely a pretty good egg. And he, I mean, Fox News, I mean, I don't watch much cable TV at all anymore, but it used to be that you'd have Hannity basically booming out the kind of normicon talking points, and then Tucker would introduce these, much more interesting ideas, much more ideas that, at least had a bit of a sense of the time that we're living in, rather than sort of rehashing stuff that could have been, said in 1980 or early 90s and stuff. So, but he has he has the capacity to reach, a whole bunch of younger people as well. I mean,
well, what do you think is his, like? How do you think he does that? Like, what is his specific appeal? I mean, if people like Hannity and whatnot are just, is it just that they're sort of just giving the people what they've wanted for 20 years, whereas Tucker is kind of like, okay, all of that is boring. Like, we've been there before. What if we sort of push the Overton window just a slight nudge? And do you think that is his appeal, or does he just sort of naturally instinctively get it?
I think the guy, like I read it. He's an excellent journalist. It really is an excellent journalist, like in terms of like his craft. I read that book, Ship of Fools. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. I've been meaning to. Yeah,
it's really quite interesting because it doesn't it examines people like, Ralph Nader, the former Green presidential candidate, and not Gloria Steinem, but the one who wrote, it's a classic, about the house. She was a communist, but it was basically the housewife's plight, and launched whatever we are, or second, third wave feminism. But he was actually very sympathetic in a way, like to Ralph Nader. He was saying, "Look, I'm an environmentalist. I kind of, he has integrity. Ralph Nader, he didn't sell out like so many of the other people that did in the environmental movement. He still writes a little column, but he's completely being disowned by, the Democratic Party, because he supposedly cost Al Gore the election. And likewise, he engages with the person and tries to pull out nuggets of truth, even though he may not disagree with the rest. And that's just not what people like Fox and Hannity types do. They're much more either grabbing a person and getting whatever they call liberals over there and making them look silly, or trying to sort of expose their often nonsensical opinions. But it sort of becomes, it's more like a game rather than an engagement. And he genuinely does have, like, he's 50. I think he said he was 57, like 56. He still sort of seems like a kind of preppy style. Like you're sort of chatting to him, in a
one of the last of the wasps, right? One of the last.
Well, he says that he lives in New England now, right? But he is, I think, California was where he grew up, and he often harks back to it in the 80s, was the greatest place in the world. Like, it was, and I think there's another writer which you may be aware of, like Peachy Keenan. She was an Anon, and she wrote a book called Domestic Terrorist. Have you heard of her? She's got some very sassy takes on the world, but she also kind of laments what has happened to the California that they grew up in. But he has New England connections of some respect, but he also grew up in DC. So I think the guy has basically genuinely been ticked off or seen a lot of the kind of corruption up close, and because he has what, at least you never get too close to your heroes, but he genuinely seems like he has a wholesome kind of upbringing. One thing I also read about the guy is when he was growing up, well, his mum left, or he comes from a broken home, but they used to have these, I think his dad may have been in journalism or something, but they used to have these family dinners where they just talked for 3 hours. Like, so he's, if nothing else, like an excellent conversationalist, right? Someone you can just really engage with, and he was able to chat with Clive and answer Clive's old questions and all the rest of it. Yeah. So, so he's another personality.
I was going to say, I think as well, like just going back to what you're talking about, how his sort of the difference between him and other sort of commentators as well. And we should probably get into what the highlights of the show were as well. But I think the difference between sort of him and others is that conservative sort of right-wing commentators, and we see this like a lot in Australia with Sky News and Fox News as well, but also just like, the cultural warrior sort of thing, is that they sort of have this hubris where it's like, oh, we're on the side of the people and we're going to sort of force what we think is the right issue onto the world. And it's kind of just like one-dimensional and boring and a bit sort of like numbskull. Whereas I think, Tucker's a bit more sort of Machiavellian. He reads the world for what it is, and he just sort of like, he's not forcing his sort of perspective onto the world. He sort of is just like, all he has to do, he knows that the world is in such a bad position that he just sort of has to sort of say, well, isn't this interesting? This is sort of how it is. And people will respond to his sort of, highlights of decline, right? He's one of those sort of people who kind of like, to borrow a quote from somebody else, knows what time it is, sort of thing. And it's not just like, it isn't a game. It's actually, he genuinely seems to take it far more seriously at like a civilizational level. And he's just sort of, he sees his role as a sort of almost educational, like, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
About it,
I mean, he's like, Americans that arrive in Australia, it was Tucker's first trip ever in Australia, are always a bit, look, I remember listening to some podcast, and they always do it. Karl Rove was being called up from Tom Switzer or someone, and they were saying like, oh, Australians are just like Texans or all this sort of stuff, and it just exposed a certain kind of cluelessness. But Tucker was interested in things like, he just arrived in Cairns. He did a show in Cairns of all places as his first tour in Australia, and in Brisbane the second. But he'd been out with animals and in the rainforests up there. I mean, he was like fascinated by cassowaries and how they could kill people and how, he again, he's a clever enough journalist to know that he didn't quite have enough information about the subject matter to be expressing kind of like, superficial opinions about Australia yet. He was you could just tell he was in the kind of gathering, assessing, information gathering mode.
Yeah, and it's a great trait to have. So what were some highlights from the show for you from him? You said he discussed immigration as well.
Oh, he did. Yeah. Funny you should mention that. He did. He said it could have come out of Migration Watch's Twitter feed. He said that migration is the number one issue facing the Anglo. He referred to them as Anglo countries and Anglo-Saxon countries, which is an interesting way of phrasing, because usually people sort of English speaking or Western, but that was, I don't know what precisely why I was using that. I guess to distinguish it from maybe India and other places. But anyway, he just talked about how the same things that were affecting cities in the United States and cities in Europe, the inability of young people to be able to own houses, and how that was driven by, and how the system is simply, you just need to step back. The system is not working for passing on the lifestyle that the baby boomer generation had to the younger, the next generation. So that's not how it should work. Like at the very least, what's that song? That line from Billy Joel's Allentown. Every guy had a pretty good shot to get at least as far as their old man got, and that's not. There's a very small percentage that are able to do that, and you have to be like, hit the Bitcoin.
Well, that's actually a really good insight about crypto as well. Is that it's one of those things where I think a lot of like Western guys sort of they come into the 20s and 30s and they're like, wow, I should be doing far better than I actually am. Like organically, the only way out is through sort of like crypto or something like that. It's this interesting psychological thing where it's like, where are these living standards and riches that I thought I was promised? So
it's highly speculative. Yeah, I mean, basically, he's saying get involved in highly speculative investments. I've as a lawyer, I've done a lot of Bitcoin and crypto stuff, so I'm sort of but as a pure investment proposition, it's basically people looking around and thinking, I can't get to where I attain the lifestyle that my parents got through the conventional path. Therefore, I have to kind of hit it out of the park through some other means. And that's kind of what red pilled me as well. Was like very simply thinking like, okay, like I don't know about you, but like sometimes I sort of get sort of competitive with my parents, which might sound pathetic, but I compare where I am, I measure where I am now at my age versus where they were at their age, and it's like, oh, they had a house and 2 cars and traveled once a year, and I sort of worked my way back from that. It's like, why do I not have the same living standards? And there's an obvious sort of decline and financially, socially, you go down this rabbit hole and you're like, oh, everything has actually just gotten worse. Like I think even Hunter S. Thompson after 9/11 was like, this is going to be the first generation that's going to have worse living standards than the one before it. Yeah. It's hard because you still got the trappings of, you can still go downtown and enjoy the latest technological. Still essentially that shot of the Gold Coast the other day, and there's not, still go and swim in the beach. There's always think like places like Australia and Canada, it could literally be Stalinist hell, but as long as you can surf or cut some powder in the snow, people aren't kind of sort of going to have the same mentality as I don't know, so you're in the gulag. So it's sort of
No, that's true. But we're not exactly there yet. But it's hard to think about decline when you're on like a Gold Coast beach. But I mean, I do. But it takes a particular sort. But it's you can get Amaretto sours from a cocktail bar, right? Like that's great. But it's also like I can't afford a house on 4 years' wages, and the composition of my city is changing rapidly. The culture is like different. Like there's this interesting sort of. I was talking to somebody else about this recently. It's like materially things are great, right? Like you can buy a cheap TV, you can plug into like the internet and connect with all sorts of interesting sort of things, and I love it. Right? I wouldn't go back in time, right? But the fact of the matter is we've got material wealth, and that's great. But on the other hand, it's like okay, social cohesion smashed apart. Family smashed apart. All these other sort of meaningful things are sort of deteriorating. But
Well, Tucker is exactly on this line, and it's not the type of I mean, this is and it is. This is not what Hannity talks about, right? He doesn't. He talks about the libs being silly, or I don't know. I don't even watch much of Ben Shapiro, but it's about getting the libs and and ramming down an ideological line, and don't they understand free markets and capitalism and open minds and markets and that sort of stuff. And Tucker gets that. And I just actually also think that with Twitter and new media and stuff, there's a lot of just interesting off the wall stuff out there. And if they're curious minded, who can curate stuff and know to know what they're looking for, you can get real sources of information that you could never get in the past. I mean, I just increasingly, and I think Elon Musk said this on Twitter, it's like these days you open up the newspaper and you're effectively, you're reading something which has been discussed on Twitter 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's right.
But look, I mean, credit to Clive Palmer. He was the guy who decided to get Tucker out here.
Yeah.
He's touring Australia, and I think it'll be an interesting for him. And I think by the end of his tour, he'll probably say even some more perceptive things, because he said in the conference he's watching the newspapers, and you sort of cringe to think what Tucker Carlson thinks of the ABC or I don't know, AM radio in the morning. But I'm sure there's usual trash that they have over there as well. He said that Australia, but he's not. He said racial politics is poison. It's been really ramped up in the United States, at least in the media, for political reasons, and that his advice, I think, trying to paraphrase the guy, but is like, do not try get that here in Australia, because it's very hard to unwind. Although he said on a day-to-day basis, interactions, black, white, over in the United States is fine, but it's certainly being pushed there, and it's very corrosive to national unity and the like. What else did he say? I mean, he said that he was very much, again, he said this, that the way they distract you in the media is to prioritize things that you're not actually that important to you. So they'll push something, Russia or global warming, I think was his examples, when that's actually not real. They're not focused on immigration like they should be. Not focused on the deindustrialization of the West. They're not focused on living standards, massive, family breakdown and the like. And that's something that really, because that has so much more consequence to individual than who controls Donbass, really. But that's not what the media pumps at you 24/7. So he just said that's the bias that exists out there. It's the selection of stories. That's the one that is the most important thing. And I guess it's not. I've heard that before, but it's interesting hearing him emphasize that. He'd just be an interesting kind of guy to sit down and have a chat with. And there were some other talkers at the beginning of Dinesh D'Souza was there, and he had this big video on election fraud, and there were people at the beginning talking about some of the harms that have been caused from the vaccine injuries and all the rest of it. And I think Clive Palmer was behind some of these court cases. He's now disclosed that he was behind, but He's
Yeah.
he's a kind of interesting guy. I mean, what do you make of Clive Palmer? What's your take on him?
I think it was possible we were talking about in the last episode, like people with good, really good instincts that kind of just come naturally, even if politically they may not be as politically successful as maybe they should be or something like that. They at least have good instincts. Look, I think he's probably he's one of those guys that has the right idea on things.
Why didn't he become like a Donald Trump? Because in theory, there's similarity. In principle, there's similarities. Rich, kind of idiosyncratic. I think he was putting out some pretty crazy, social media posts at some stage as well. But my explanation is that he didn't actually have the issues. He didn't have the build
that's right.
the immigration, the trade, and everything else. He just was Clive Palmer. I care about you more. And without the platform, the Nat Connie platform, dare I say, he wasn't able. He was limited. His appeal was somewhat limited, but.
Yeah. I think the UAP thing was necessary at the time, and it was good that there was a sort of minor resistance. But I don't think like anti-vax politics is a winning platform. Like it was an understandable platform during COVID. It's like, the government is tyrannical and it's forcing people into their homes and forcing shots on the people, and that's insane. And let's rally against this politically. But it's not a sort of deeper political mandate. It's very sort of almost like surface level reactionary. And I just don't know if that I supported him. Like I was like, he was probably like my second vote or something like that, right? But I think you're right, to get the success that I think he sort of deserved or wanted. It's what's the difference between him and Donald Trump? It's like Trump sort of went on the stage and he said, look, America's in decline. We basically don't have borders. Everything feels like it's getting worse. Crime is getting worse. We're getting a raw deal on trade. Like he just came to the table with like just these full like pointed like ideas that like struck at the chord of like basically all of like the GOP and more. Whereas Clive kind of came to the table and he said, look, vaccines are bad and the government's tyrannical. It's like, yeah, that's true. But if you want
the vaccine stuff, he ran before the COVID as well. He actually did.
That's true,
retrospect, he did pretty well. He sort of established a party. He got elected a lower house seat in Sunny Coast seat in Fairfax. He got, I think, 3 senators, or maybe 4 senators, which is a pretty good showing for a party just from scratch. So people were looking for an alternative, and he. Look, Tucker mentioned, Tucker, amongst many things, I think it was the Iraq War, but also he said, but also the crazy COVID stuff, which was, eye-opening to him, and additionally just makes you wonder what, is this just the madness of crowds, or is there something more to it, or is it the agenda that's being pushed? Is it being coordinated, or is it simply just the machine running on autopilot? And it's just a springboard to re-examine a whole lot of different things. The good thing about Tucker is too, so I just go back to him, is that he's actually moved. He knows all the movers and shakers, both in the journalistic world and in the political world personally. He William F. Buckley, he knows him, and is critical of him, and see their pros and cons. Guy has been very much part of the Washington D establishment. I think he said he lived in Washington D for 35 years. So he knows them all. And I guess he's just with that, it makes it particularly interesting because you're getting someone who had a ringside seat of the swamp during it. It's up, and so he speaks with additional credibility. But Clive Palmer, look, I think he's just not as schooled, like politically schooled, despite the fact that he was in political parties and stuff. I just don't think he has quite he's not like Tucker he's like a full well-rounded view. He has instincts, and some of them are good, and some of them are probably self-serving, and some of them are commercial. He's a bit, you know, you can see, he reminds me, the Trump thing is, you know how he said he's like, sort of, I think it was in The Art of the Deal or something. It's advantageous to be a little bit unpredictable because you don't know whether you're going to strike. Clive has that, as I think a lot of business people do. You think they're kind of slightly crazy. You don't know where they're coming from, but I think they've learned it's advantageous to actually have that pose because, you know, you can put your potential partner offside, or you could strike when you need to strike. And but yeah, no, he's credit to him for bringing out Tucker. I think it's a really good thing for him to come out here and hopefully shake up the media. You know, I think you said you were trying to get a podcast. We haven't obviously got Tucker yet on the NatCon podcast. But you never know.
It would be great if we did, but I think possibly a bit of a stretch. But yeah, no, it's an interesting move from Clive as well, bringing him out because it's, I mean, he's a businessman, and this is possibly like a money-making venture, but obviously they're politically aligned, and it sort of signals to me as well that Clive is sort of bringing somebody out. I wonder if this is like Clive's way of sort of like, you know, getting this sort of Nat Connie sort of guy, right, out from America to Australia, and sort of saying, I wonder if this is like Clive signaling like almost Nat Con intentions, right? Like maybe, if he's not running again or something like that, and he's sort of saying, all right, I'm not running again. Like I've tried that a couple of times, and you know, try to move the needle. But what I can do is I can bring Tucker Carlson out and try and sort of, get Australia a bit more politically savvy. So maybe it's actually, on top of being probably a decent business move, maybe this sort of signals also, I mean, it's also an interesting point from like almost like a donor class perspective. Like I was speaking to an American guy a couple of days ago. He was sort of saying like just DC is awash in funds for like, you know, sort of conservative thought, right-wing thought, Trumpist thought, right? And if you're a capable person who's trustworthy and is in sort of, you know, knows the network, you can probably get money to do things, right? And I think Australia's sort of donor class, I don't know, I mean, I'm not super as involved politically and haven't been for a few years. I don't know if you agree with that as well, but it just seems Australia is like maybe not as advanced or developed or
it's a smaller market. I mean, what the donor class, to the extent that I've known people who donate to political parties and the rest of it, I think they would be much more Hannity kind of aligned than Tucker aligned. You know, they're Liberal Party stalwarts have been, or, you know, well, I'm talking centre right side of things, Liberal Party, National Party stalwarts that have been probably family involved or donated to sometimes social conservative causes, sometimes, you know, long-standing donors of institutes like the IPA, ICRIS, bit corporate-y, certainly believe in like open borders, free market. And, you know, I noticed the IPA is a little bit more critical of immigration, but the CI, Centre for Immigrant Studies in Sydney, is certainly not. And it just hasn't floated up as you know, I think we mentioned the last time we had a kind of period of 3 months where people were talking about immigration. And then all of a sudden, this nuclear idea has been put forward by Peter Dutton, the the leader of the opposition, which I think, you know, it's all very worthy. You've got to do something. Our electricity grid is, you know, probably going to melt down at some stage, and it's certainly getting more expensive. But it's what Tucker Carlson said, didn't mention nuclear power at all in his whole speech. You know,
it's another one of those examples like of what it sounded like Tucker was talking about, of like, you know, the media and politics sort of like choosing the agenda and knocking the important things down that people actually care about. And it goes back to that sort of that, I think it was like Bob Hawke or something who said it, like there's an implicit agreement between the media and politicians, both sides of politics, to not talk about certain things. I'm guessing A, because they treated them as unsolvable, and B, you know, their donors didn't want them to talk about it, so it was sort of like politically unsafe. But it's like the fact that immigration has, you know, been bumped off the newsreel by this discussion of nuclear. Part of me sort of thinks like, I wonder if like the Liberal Party are just testing messages. Like they're sort of like, okay, let's do a few weeks of immigration. let's see how that sort of polls after that. Let's do a few weeks of nuclear or something like that. But I mean, look, this idea of nuclear, I'm pro nuclear, like fine, like build it, but it's like no like person, no like average Australian cobber is sitting in their like recliner chair after like working 12 days manual labor or something like that. And they're like, you know what we need? We need nuclear energy. It's like, no, dude, they're thinking about their wage being stagnant. They're thinking about like their house or rent getting unaffordable, insurance going up 25%, right? They're not, it just feels like this sort of elite class thing that has kind of popped up and is politically advantageous, because now it just means that Labor and Liberal can talk about this hypothetical thing that won't happen for 30 years, right? Doesn't affect anybody like tangibly right now. It's kind of this like Girardian scapegoat where it's like, well, you know, let's have an all-out war, political election, right?
I often like trying to reduce things to like the Viking village. And I'm thinking
Yeah.
like this, now there's a debate. Some Vikings in the village think that, you know, we should sort of maybe use the stream to generate hydro. And the other Vikings are thinking, no, let's just continue to burn the logs, right? And big debate. But meanwhile, the village is being, you know, inundated.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, people. So which is more
fire.
important for the long-term survival of the village? Like what you know, 30 years time. I mean, honestly, my eyes glaze over a little bit with these plans because I know they're never going to fully come to fruition. But in 30 years' time, Australia will be a very different culturally and economic place because of, you know, immigration and other changes. And you know, it's not going to matter that much, at least with.
No, you're right. And again, it's why I think it's almost like a scapegoat issue. I was also speaking to somebody else who was sort of, you know, ardently pro-nuclear. And they were sort of saying like the reason why we need nuclear is because Australia is going to one day have this massive population because of immigration. And so we need nuclear to support the massive population. And I was kind of thinking, how about just not having the massive population? Like, why not? You know, we're spending all this time talking about fucking nuclear. You know, the simplest solution, I think, would simply to be do what we're doing now. We have endless resources of coal and gas. We can really ease people's living standards. You know, first of all, and then we can deal with nuclear. But
I mean, the non-conspiratorial answer is that basically the journalists get a bit sick of talking about one subject and just want to talk about something else. And so you've got to make it interesting in the media to talk about something. And yet they do, like, if they've got a particular issue which they focus on, I mean, you know, foreign conflicts, Iraq War, Ukraine, they can certainly generate endless copy on those subjects. Whereas, you know, not, again, I'm sure we're in agreement, but I mean, in terms of like the real consequences or you know, what actually matters to the lives of Australians, that's a far bigger issue than whatever happens over there. And Tucker was, he was just definitely on hopefully, because, you know, journalists are famously a herd of independent minds. They are influenced by people who are successful in their trade. And the fact that he is out here and made a name for themselves. I mean, there was always, there was a bit of hostility, I think, amongst some News Corp people to Tucker. It was either professional jealousy or whether they just, I don't know, it's a very competitive game, the old media. But, you know, there's certainly no figure, you know, opinion page regular writer who is spouting the Tucker line in the national broadsheets that I can think of in Australia. And admittedly, we're a smaller market, but it's just ironic that the biggest probably name in media, the most successful, is occupying a niche that no other journalist in Australia is writing about. Right? You got to ask yourself, well, hang on, surely that might be something you might want to get into if it has such a massive audience. And
why do you think that is? Is it simply just a matter of sort of sclerosis, that sort of journalists who got their job and rose the rank 30 years ago are still in this position and they're still holding on to these ideas? Like, is it because there's guys like Adam Creighton at the Australian, I think he has pretty good ideas. and he's sort of notably one of the younger ones as well. So maybe it's the
But
sort of
he's
generation.
pro-immigration. He's pro-immigration, and he's open borders on
Is
trade.
he? Oh,
He
that's not
is.
good. Okay,
Yeah,
all
he's
right. Well,
famously biggest. I mean, he was excellent on COVID,
yeah,
and Judith Sloan can write a pretty mean column on
that's true.
immigration occasionally. Who else? But then it's few and far between. I mean, Carmel McGuinness, that's her name? James Morrow. They can write, but it's not sustained. And maybe look, maybe it's a precarious position. These journalists, they've seen some of their colleagues go by the wayside for saying, being labelled, making an intemperate remark probably about immigration, and they're probably nervous about approaching it, or probably, and also on the the infrastructure in Australia that's built up, the think tank infrastructure since the 80s was all liberal, free, globalist. So this the whole CIS, that's their whole origin story, right? That we helped open up Australia, the IPA, although it's around for a lot longer, that's what they kind of did. And now they're going to have to go back and sort of reassess from first principles. There was a great, the think tanks in the US, Heritage and American Enterprise Institute, and the whole lot of them. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but there was a get together like a couple of months after the Trump victory in 2016, and R.R. Reno, who is the editor of a magazine called First Things, he said, "Isn't it ironic?" Well, I'm paraphrasing, but it's interesting that the biggest issue that determined this election, immigration, is the one issue that none of the think tanks in DC have a permanent person dedicated to talking about, right? Like, so, they talk about minimum wages and all this sort of stuff, but nothing. So they're clearly missing a trick, and people like Tucker, even if he's not genuine, but I do think he is genuine, have spotted a massive market opening which the public are clearly interested in, and are providing content for that. But nuclear. Look, man. I've all my friends and all other people. There's certain amongst particular circles. There's excitement for it just because they're doing something. But to me, politically, it's a 50-50 issue. Whereas immigration, you can get applause on Q&A, the ABC, for saying you should reduce that immigration. You get applause on, so it's more like a 70% issue. So shouldn't you be chasing the 70% one rather than the 50% one? But
Well, like nobody in Europe or America, like nobody in the EU elections or like recent elections over there won on the mandate of like more nuclear, right? Like all of their top things were basically immigration. And it's amazing to me that like the Liberal Party are still seeing what's going on over there, even with like reform, right? And they're like, no, we should probably talk about this fucking thing. Like 3 years later. I like it.
I might say the same thing too. It's like, well, hang on, there's massive big political revolts in the United States, massive political in Europe. Clearly, they mustn't have nuclear power. Oh, hang on, they do have nuclear power already. So how come? If that's not the panacea to their problems, how can it be the panacea to ours? And yes, net zero and politics plays a role in the debate in the UK and elsewhere, but I just don't think it has the salience that immigration does. I don't believe it was a big issue in France. Marine Le Pen, there was somewhat squishy consensus on that to some extent, but there were big differences because it wasn't the biggest issue. So there was a much bigger divide on the other stuff, the cultural and immigration stuff. So, and that's what propelled them into power. So
I guess if you want to get conspiratorial as well about why the Liberal Party are sort of, I've spoken about this before as well with Spectator TV, and I've written it for the Specky as well. And I think it's basically an open secret too, right? Like everybody basically knows, the major reason why a centre-right party like the Liberals, despite immigration being such, a salient and fruitful issue that they could run on and be like a genuine sort of almost populist party, is because, they are dependent on donations from big businesses, which financially depend on continued GDP growth, continued stream of workers, continued, cheaper, flattened wages, basically. I think what the difference is that, Trump sort of smashed apart that dependence for the GOP. And he said, look, we're going to simultaneously cut immigration and we're going to also grow the economy. And I do think that is possible as well. I mean, the fact that we're growing our population with immigration and our economy is shrinking sort of says to me, this doesn't work anymore.
No, I agree. If it ever did work, right? Like, I mean, I think actually per capita growth is a term which is sort of relatively recently been introduced into the media lexicon. Like, there wasn't all, we were just, somewhat mindlessly just referring to GDP in the past, but then GDP per capita started to come in the last couple of years. It wasn't always like that. But yeah, look, clearly, what's that famous and overused line that it's very hard to convince a man of something if their paycheck depends on it or something. So there's a bit of that, definitely. But there's also, I think there is, people have been politically burned in the past, and, the media personalities have been burned in the past by saying too provocative things on immigration. There was, in the 80s, with Jeffrey Blaney and John Howard, a discussion about, much more full-throated discussion of immigration. In fact, I was reading the other day Jeffrey Blaney's book, which I think it's called All for Australia, worth getting your hands on, hard to get your hands on. That's the one that got him fired from Melbourne University. I mean, he's a professor of history. He's
really, wow.
Yeah. And I don't think, just shows that, I don't know, it is a bit of a dangerous little zone to attack. So that's
really
why.
Is. Yeah. I was just going to say, it really is, but it's just, we're sort of entering a stage now where it's almost kind of unavoidable. Like, yes, we can avoid talking about it. I think the consequences of not talking about it and risking, a career with like a slip of the tongue or something like that, you kind of need to start taking those risks. Otherwise, the alternative is looking pretty bad, in my opinion. But,
I also think, and this is part of the reason why, we set up this thing. It's because people didn't know how to talk about it other than like or dislike immigrants, and they didn't, it was really so basic, and it wasn't, and they assumed that anyone was anti-immigration must have some sort of animus towards other countries or nations, or lack of curiosity, or be naturally a Philistine. And, there was some very bookish people to take a, I'm obviously the based one in this conversation, but yeah, there were some bookish types out there who like, Samuel Huntington, and talking about like cultural drivers and how we're not, living in an ideological age, who were making these points. But I just don't think that the average politician, schooled in Milton Friedman and all the rest of it, just really got it. They still haven't really moved on from 1989, despite the fact that they, occasionally will bend a knee to those authors and stuff. They still go back, and it's an ideological struggle rather than a kind of, that we're in. And that's why they'll happily get out, Neil Ferguson, or, those types from London. Like, they'll sponsor these trips from people from the UK, but why wasn't, and I mean, admittedly, Tucker's probably a bit more expensive. And they have, in fairness, Mark Stein was making these points, and they will bring him out here. But he is, I guess, I guess Douglas Murray's writing these books. They do bring him out here, but it's certainly, I don't know. It's almost like they're a vaudeville show. Like they're entertaining, and aren't they smart, making these clever points, and then, oh well, that's a good show, we'll go back and to Parliament and vote on exactly the same things we were always voting on, and not actually take some of these points on board. But yeah, man, so you're heading off to the States and going to connect with some other people over there, and there's going
to spread the good word of national conservatism, Australia, and get some ideas from them as well, I think. But nationalism's going global, right?
The US is every time it's so dynamic, you just can't help but walk away with a bit of being re-energized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and everything that's going on in Europe. I'll be over there in Europe as well, so everything that's
well, you'll be like our man on the spot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we'll do some podcasts from there. Well, Ben, let's wrap it up for now, and we'll check in again wherever we both are next week.
Sounds good. Perfect. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. See ya.